Thanks, Rod. Okay, so we have mentioned GHS a couple of times today, and I think most people would be aware of GHS. So we thought it would just be important to maybe, with the audience in mind, give just some more perspective on what it is, how it works, and how the changes that you can see on the labels going forward. So the GHS stands for the Globally Harmonized System of Classification and Labeling of Chemicals. So it's a classification system that's published by the United Nations, and it gets revised every second year. Currently we're using the 10th revised edition that was published in 2023. And essentially you can see the text in bold. It's an internationally harmonized approach to classification and labeling. Okay, so how does the GHS work? The GHS essentially provides standardized methods for the classification of hazardous chemicals according to their inherent properties that could pose a risk for humans or the environment. And based on these hazards that have been identified, the resultant hazard communication is then standardized on labels and SDSs. So to classify a chemical according to GHS, you'd remember in the previous presentation we said sometimes you can use ECHA if you don't have experimental data, or you can use experimental data if you have that data available. So what's the advantages of having such a harmonized system? So it enhances the protection of human health and the environment by providing an internationally comprehensible system for hazard communication, so everyone in the world understands and have the same labels and same safety data sheets. It provides a recognized framework for countries without an existing system. It also reduces the need for testing and evaluation of chemicals, seeing as you can use the different components of your chemical to extrapolate that data onto a formulation. And it also facilitates international trade in chemicals whose hazards have been properly assessed and identified on an international basis. So if we look at the implementation of GHS in South Africa specifically, Elise spoke about the regulations for hazardous chemical agents, and the GHS essentially came from those regulations that were published in March 2021, and the regulations for agricultural remedies that were published last year in August then aligned that requirement for agricultural remedies specifically. So at the moment, we are a bit in a transition period, and because your label is a legal document, it has to go to the registrar to get approved, so there's a bit of a lag phase, but essentially, in future, all labels will be GHS classified. Okay, so what are the implications for agricultural remedies and what changes can we expect? So to provide you with the changes, I think it's important that we look at the old system as well, which was the WHO. So before GHS was implemented, we used the World Health Organization method for classifying and labeling of pesticides. And as we said, it's a classification and labeling system, so you would see a difference in the hazard classification of the chemical and also the labeling of a chemical. And this is reflected on the label and the safety data sheets of the chemical. So what is important to note is that the hazards and the formulation of the chemical did not necessarily change. It's just the way in which these hazards are classified and communicated to the user. So the product stayed the same, it's just labeled differently. So if we look at the old system, the World Health Organization classification, in terms of human health hazards, only acute toxicity were taken into account, and this was also just for oral exposure and dermal exposure. So you would see in GHS, we also take into account acute toxicity for inhalation. This classification was also only based on the active ingredient, and the acute toxicity of the pesticide was then communicated by means of a color band, a corresponding word reflecting this toxicity and then precautionary pictograms that were on the color band. So I think you're all familiar with what it looked like with the red band, yellow band, and blue band reflecting the acute toxicity. This is what it looked like with various pictograms for storage, handling, applications, and warnings on your color band. Again, just an example of the old label for comparison with our color band at the bottom reflecting the hazards associated with the chemical. Okay, then we have a look at the GHS. So the GHS is more comprehensive with regards to hazard communication. For acute toxicity, all routes of exposure are considered. So it's not just oral and dermal, but it also includes inhalation. And the GHS also takes into account chronic health hazards, physical hazards, and environmental hazards, which wasn't included in the WHO system. And unlike WHO, that only took into account the active ingredient and the hazards associated with the active ingredient, in this case, you will use the whole formulation for the classification. And then these hazards are communicated by means of pictograms, a signal word, hazard statements, and precautionary statements. So similar to what I showed in the previous presentation, just to show you what the GHS covers. So we have 3 main hazard classes: physical hazards, health hazards, and environmental hazards. And you see for physical hazards, it's like explosive, flammable gases, liquids and solids, chemicals under pressure, self-reactive substances and mixtures. Usually for agricultural remedies, we don't see a lot of physical hazards, maybe flammable liquids also. Most of the hazards associated with agricultural remedies would be health hazards, and this is, like we mentioned, acute toxicity, respiratory or skin sensitization, specific target organ toxicity, carcinogenicity, all different types of health hazards, which are mostly what agricultural remedies have flagged. And then environmental hazards, toxic to the aquatic environment or hazardous to the ozone layer. In general, agricultural remedies would be mostly, a lot of them could have aquatic toxicity, not really that much the ozone layer. And then hazard categories. Again, this is taking into account the severity within a hazard class. So for each of these hazards, you will have a category associated with it, with category 1 being the most severe, category 2 less severe, and so forth. Okay, just to give an example, so if we're looking at carcinogenicity as a hazard, you will look at the severity, and this would be given by the category. And if, for example, your product is flagged for carcinogenicity category 1B, you would have a symbol associated with it, the health hazard symbol, which is this pictogram. You would have a signal word that is flagged because that hazard was flagged. In this case, it is danger. And then you would have hazard statements associated with the hazard that was flagged. And you would see it says may cause cancer. And then you have precautionary statements that's flagged by the hazard. So it's standardized, and all of those precautions that you need to take would then reflect ways in which you would reduce the risk of being exposed to that specific hazard. So these are the pictograms that's used in GHS. So you'd see the first 4. The 5th one can be health and physical, but the first 4 are physical hazards. And like I mentioned, mostly for agricultural remedies, you would only really see flammable, except maybe for aerosols. Then we have acute toxicity, which is the skull and crossbone. So essentially, if you look at acute toxicity, remember we said with WHO, we used acute toxicity to decide on the color of the color band. So for red band products, those were acutely toxic. So those would flag that skull and crossbone. So essentially, if you want to work out which are acutely toxic or the old red bands, they will always have that skull and crossbone. And then chronic toxicity, the health hazard, pictogram, exclamation mark, and one showing that it's toxic to the aquatic environment. There are two different signal words that can be flagged depending on the severity of the hazard. So you have danger or warning, and danger is used for more severe hazards, warning for less severe hazards. You will always, with your formulation, only have one signal word that is flagged. So for example, if you look at all of your different hazard classes for your formulation, if danger is flagged by any of those, you will always include danger as the signal word. If only less severe hazards are flagged, the final classification would have a warning signal word. So if we look at the label layout, the pictogram, signal word, main hazard statements, and precautionary statements will be included on the front panel of the label. There will no longer be a color band. All hazard statements and precautionary statements will be included on the secondary display panel, so only the main ones on the main panel and all of them on the secondary panel. And another addition that is important to take note of, remember we said the whole formulation is used for the classification and not just the active ingredient. On the SDS and the label, you will have relevant substances, and these relevant substances essentially include all of the co-formulants that contributed to the final hazard classification. So if you have a co-formulant in your formulation that's hazardous, it will be listed on your label and your SDS. So this is an example of what the label would look like, and you would see we no longer have the color band at the bottom, but you have a pictogram with a signal word underneath it, and next to that pictogram and signal word you have the hazard statement related to those hazards, and then the precautionary statements that's flagged by the hazard. Again, only the main ones will be included on the main panel, seeing as some of them could have several hazards and several pictograms. All of the pictograms will be on there, but not all of the precautionary statements necessarily. As we said, GHS also has the safety data sheet is part of the GHS classification process. So the GHS gives us a standard way of doing a safety data sheet. And all relevant information regarding the hazards, precautions, relevant substances, and that contributed to the final hazard classification, all of that is included on the SDS. And all of the GHS SDSs will have exactly the same layout, and they have 16 sections, so you can easily find exactly the section with the information that you need. Section 2 is the hazard identification, and that's where your hazard classification information will be. Again, we looked at the hazard versus risk in the previous presentation. Remember that risk is hazard times exposure, so all that the GHS wants to do is give you information on the hazards and then give you precautions to take to ensure you keep the risk low of any harm occurring. So it only gives you information on hazards, not risks. Okay, so as you heard, GHS is already mandatory, but because we have to submit all of our labels to the department for approval, it is a bit of a lag phase. So obviously also as new products come to market, the final marketing labels will have to change. So there's a bit of a lag phase, but essentially going forward, all labels will be classified according to GHS. Okay, we also have some information on GHS on our website, just a basic explanation of how it works. We're still working on it, and essentially we will hopefully send out to all registration holders a QR code that can be included on labels, because our regulations, tells us that we need to give more information on GHS and the hazards and how it works to the end user. So we will hopefully be able to put that on the label for easy access so everyone can understand how the GHS works. And that's it. Thank you very much.